Hello, day drinkers. Sorry, we're a few minutes late today. I was talking to Elena, and this book we're gonna have a lot to talk about tonight. Day Drinking with Authors is a podcast and an interview series where I pick a drink and I pick a book. The author picks a drink and we discuss both. And tonight, my guest is Elena Gorokhova and her book, A Train to Moscow, which is fascinating and painful to read right now, but I cannot recommend this book enough. So if you haven't read it, here's the back cover copy. Mom, you would love this book. You should pick this book up, absolutely. So here's the back cover copy because my mother likes that. In post-World War II Russia, a girl must reconcile a tragic past with her hope for the future in this powerful and poignant novel about family secrets, passion and loss, perseverance and ambition. In a small provincial town behind the Iron Curtain, Sasha lives in a house full of secrets, one of which is her own dream of becoming an actress. When she leaves for Moscow to audition for drama school, she defies her mother and grandparents and abandons her first love, Andrei. Before she leaves, Sasha discovers the hidden war journal of her uncle Kolya, an artist still missing in the action years after the war has ended. His pages expose the official lies and the forbidden truth of Stalin's brutality. Kolya's revelations and his tragic love story guide Sasha through drama school and cement her determination to live 1,000 lives on stage. After graduation, she begins acting in Leningrad, where Andrei, now a Communist Party apparatchik, we'll find out the proper pronunciation of that, becomes a censor of her work. As a past secret comes to light, Sasha's ambitions converge with Andrei's duties, and Sasha must decide if her dreams are truly worth the necessary sacrifice, and if, as her grandmother likes to say, all will indeed be well. Tonight, as we're talking, for every comment and every like, we will be donating $1 to UNICEF Canada to help war efforts in Ukraine, to help kids in the Ukraine. It's certainly on the top of my mind while I'm reading this book, and we'll certainly be talking about it. So let's bring in Elena. Hello, Elena.
Hi, Molly. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this book.
Well, Elena, I was saying this, as is often the case with this little interview series that I have, as I start talking to the authors before we go live, and this book, it does exactly what I always want literature to do, which is it teaches me something, and it makes me feel like, and this is a hard book to read right now, and I cannot imagine for you, Elena, how it must be talking about it right now. Like, what a difficult time.
It is a terrible time. And when I was writing it, I certainly didn't think that we would go back to that. The book is set in during World War II and post-World War II Russia, which was a totalitarian regime. And until 1953, when Stalin was still alive, it was the time of fear, the time of Gulag camps. And after 1953, after he died, the Gulag was, gradually dismantled, but the regime still remained totalitarian. That's when I was growing up in the 1960s and 1970s. But when I was writing this book, I certainly did not think that my country, where I was born, would go back to that totalitarian regime overnight. Overnight, practically. The Iron Curtain descended on the day when the war was announced. And I have to tell you that in Russia, you cannot call it a war. It's not a war. If you call it a war, you can be imprisoned for up to 15 years. It is called a special military operation. And it is to liberate Ukraine from the Nazis. So Ukrainians are Nazis, and their Jewish president, Zelensky, is the main Nazi. And Putin decided to liberate Ukraine, to do them a favor, to liberate Ukraine at the expense of lives, at the expense of peace in the entire world, at the expense of the economy and people's psyche, and so many lives that were disrupted, not just in Ukraine, not just in Russia, but all over the world. And I find no words to describe this and to I have family in Ukraine and friends in Kiev, and I have family and friends in Russia, in St. Petersburg and in other places. And my friends in Russia have been taken hostage to this imperial paranoia, or whatever you call it. And a lot of them have left, by the way. A lot of them have gone anywhere they could go to cross the border to just get out of that
Mhm.
new Soviet Union, really. Um, and this, unfortunately, the time in the book reflects reality, today's reality in Russia,
I,
very precisely. And I didn't think, of course, I didn't think about that, and it's very disturbing.
I I felt while I was reading it that you could see the roots of what was happening. I mean, it's hindsight, right? And beautifully well written fiction that is in many ways about this. But you can see, I mean, we're all trying to find some way of understanding the soldiers who are both walking into the Ukraine and dropping their weapons and seeing the truth of the matter and in tears over what has happened. And you were also seeing the root of the men that are killing civilians. And I feel like you are showing us generational trauma when it comes to, I mean everybody, but particularly when it comes to the men. All those men came out of the gulag and they had to go back to families and were raising sons that were to, you can just see it all snowballing. And I mean, to the painful inevitable end of your book, but also to what we're seeing right now,
Yeah,
the dangerous dangerous masculinity, or ideas around it's
yeah,
really
yeah.
concerning.
And most, I have to say that those young soldiers, Russian soldiers, they before the war started on February 24th, they were stationed on the, around the Ukrainian border, and they were told that this is an exercise. You're going to go. This is an exercise. We're going to do an exercise. Nobody really believed that Putin would start this war, this hot war, because it seemed just so insane and so suicidal, and he did. And those soldiers were ordered to go into Ukraine and to, take cities and to bombard cities and to kill civilians. And some of them refused, and some of them, put out white flags. But there were some who did not, as we know now, as the atrocities become apparent after Kiev was pretty much liberated by the Ukrainian army, and in the outskirts of Kiev, there are mass graves. There are people with tied hands behind their backs, civilians. It's just, but nothing changed, because during World War II,
it's it's in the book. It's in the history books, and another thing that you talk about in the books, um, I'm sorry, Sasha, your heroine, is a child at the beginning of the books, and she approaches some of this stuff with the innocence and sort of glibness of a child, which is like an A+ decision on your part. Like there's no judgment. She's just living her life and seeing what she's seeing. But the way that the story and the rules and the history changes depending on the regime, like it all gets wiped out. It all, like the story, nobody talks about what happened under threat
no,
of death, so this new story is created. Like
yes,
it
yes.
is
Yes, and
history
Russia,
repeating.
unlike other countries, unlike Germany, for example, never went through looking into the roots of this evil that happened under Stalin. There was no de-Stalinization, or even the acknowledgement that Gulag killed millions of Russians who just did not agree with the regime. And I just want to say this, that the Russia in the book, during the war and post-war, and Russia today, live, as all totalitarian regimes, people live in two parallel realities. And in one reality, and we know that I knew that when I lived there, um, in one reality, there is no war. There is a special military operation. There is, this Nazi Ukraine. There are noble Russian soldiers who are saving Ukrainians from themselves. And, I hear things, some Russians who really believe this propaganda, and it's nothing but propaganda, Putin's propaganda. They say, oh, this is all staged. This is all staged. Or another narrative is Ukrainians are bombing themselves. If you can believe they actually say that. But the two parallel realities and the propaganda in Russia right now is, well, I have to tell you this. All sources of information, all television stations, all radio stations, and all uh, websites and
Any
social
information, yeah.
networks, any information is controlled by the government, by Putin's government. Everything is controlled by the government. Any social network that is not controlled by the government has been blocked. So you cannot go on Facebook, you cannot go on any kind of independent news source to find out what is really happening. And some Russians, unfortunately, watch television and believe all this and think what
Yeah.
Putin tells them. And this is such a repeat of history. This is something that I remember so well, when there were people who really believed that, that Stalin was good, that Stalin
Right.
didn't know what was happening in his name, that it was all his henchmen who were killing people. Stalin was this noble czar. And of course, it was all orchestrated by
Yeah,
Stalin.
you have that beautiful line in the book where she's sort of wondering, they're in this very small town, and she's sort of wondering, does he not know? He must not know what they're doing in his name. And it's almost like if we could just tell him, this would stop. But
Right.
that's the terrible irony.
Of course, it's an irony.
I mean, the circumstances, the tragic circumstances around this book, the how strange that this history is converging like this. But this is also your first novel, your very first novel. So one of the questions that I really love to ask on this interview series is, what did this novel, in the process of writing and publishing this novel, teach you that you didn't know, either about yourself, your process, the publishing world? What did this novel teach you?
Oh gosh, so many things, so many things. Where do I start? Well, before this novel, I wrote two memoirs, and I thought that, well, I wrote memoirs, so a novel should not be that different. Well, I was very wrong, of course. And in fact, when I submitted my first draft to my agent, and of course it wasn't the first draft, it was probably draft number 17, but for her it was the first draft. And she read it and she said, this is not a novel, this is a memoir.
Oh my. Oh no, you didn't want to hear that.
I took it back and I worked on it. Of course, it took me another year or two to just, add things and add plot lines and change, make it more of a novel. So that part was completely new to me, and that was just pure naivete on my part. I should have known better than that, but I didn't. But I also did research. Of course, it's a historical novel. Although a lot of it is based on my family history,
Yeah.
but the characters are pretty much real characters, and the setting certainly was very real. Um, but I also did a lot of research, and I read Russian novels, and particularly work by Vasily Grossman, who was a war correspondent who went with the Russian
Mm.
army, traveled all across the country, all the way to Berlin, and he traveled for about 4 years. He was with the army. So he wrote, of course, he made notes, and in fact, his notes were used at the Nuremberg trials, because
Oh my
he was
gosh.
he was one of the first who entered Treblinka. And
So
his Yeah, go
Was
ahead.
part of your the trick between, I mean, all of this gorgeous research and harrowing research and also your beautiful, memoir, was the problem figuring out the plot? Like, was the problem like tying up what is going to happen to these two young lovers years down the road, the diary of the uncle? Like, was that the tricky part? You're like, oh, you've captured the time and place and the people. Now something's got to happen.
Well, that's it. I mean, in a memoir, whatever happens, happened, and you
Right.
don't make anything up, right? So you make up dialogue, of course, in a memoir because you don't remember exactly what you said when you were 12 years old. But the major things happened. The major things that happened really happened. So you don't have to create the plot.
Right, right.
But you're a novelist. You know what you have to create. You have to make things interesting. You have to make readers want to read it. As I remind myself every day now, when my daughter was about maybe 10 and she was reading Harry Potter, it just came out. The first Harry Potter came out when she was that age about. And she read it in one night, of course, like all others did. And I asked her, what is it that makes you so glued to it, that makes you,
Right.
turn pages? And she said at 10, she said, something happens on every page.
You're like, "Damn it."
Right? And I should have told myself when I was writing this novel right away, something should happen on every page. And it didn't. And then it did, started happening on every page. So it was a learning experience. Unfortunately, it took some time, but it was
Yeah, and I
hopefully
mean, and
positive.
for a first novel, I mean, that's the learning curve in the first novel is something's gotta happen. But I will say that you use, a device or a style that I love so much, particularly when the protagonist is a kid, which is this almost dreamy, um like eyes blink open and a scene happens and it's poignant and powerful. It's encapsulated in a beautiful turn of phrase at the end, and then the eyes close and the eyes open again and you don't know how much time has passed, but it's all just this child sort of reflection of this world. And I find that so beguiling. I love it in every book that I read, but I know that that is hard. Like, that
Mhm.
is not easy. You choosing the scenes to show the reader who these people are and the things that you need to know as the reader about them as you keep reading. Was that easier because you came from memoir? Like, or was that hard like I imagine that it's hard?
There is one thing that I learned writing the two memoirs, and I learned it from Frank McCourt, the author of Angela's Ashes. I was fortunate to study with him. I was in a workshop in 2004. It was a very small workshop, 12 people in the class. So it was very, very personal, and he was brilliant as a teacher. He was as brilliant as a teacher as he is on the page. But one thing that he taught us, and he was a memoir workshop. He taught us, he tried to teach us how to write a memoir, but of course he wasn't teaching. He was just telling stories, just like in Angel's Ashes. He was telling stories, and somehow we learned something. But one of the things that he taught us, directly or indirectly, was that he was talking about hot spots in a memoir, and hot spots. I mean, how do you choose what to talk about? How do you choose the scenes? How do you
Yeah.
decide what to write about? And he said, hotspots. Hotspots are those important moments in your life or in your character's life, if you're writing a novel, when something happened, when something happens after which life is no longer the same. And that I thought was it. I mean, what, you
Yeah,
don't,
that's great. That I mean, it's something
yeah,
as a writer, but it's also like when it's told to you in that way, you're like, well, yeah. Oh my
yeah,
goodness.
of course, right? How
That's
did you
amazing.
not know that?
And I see, looking back at the particularly the first, quarter of your book, all of those little scenes, those little kind of vignette scenes, th- things start to shift her life starts to change. Then there are big moments, right? There are horrible, tragic moments. There's the moment when she finds the diary. But every moment changes something. It clicks it along a little bit.
And I think, yes, now that I talk to you, I think that's what I did. That's what I learned from him. And I sort of applied it even without knowing it,
Yeah.
to this book.
Wow, that's really interesting, Elena. I am going to, when we're done talking, I'm going to think about that for like 4 weeks. It's all I'm going to talk about with my writer friends. But one of the other things that I really loved about the book is, and you talk about it on the Amazon page. Your editor makes this comment about how you say it's a Russian novel. Of course, it's sad, but there's something. There is tremendous tragedy, and there's a sense of tragedy in your characters, right? They've lived through a lot of things. They're deeply, almost pragmatic in a way that can be a little funny, right? Like they're kind of, like I mean, it is tragic, but it is also like, so you have this line where she's just, your heroine's discovered the journal of her uncle, and her uncle was an artist, and he's really pouring out his thoughts and these things. And she talks about his naked soul, and she's like, well, that's what killed him, his naked soul and the war.
Mhm.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I found that all the way through that. And you you grew up in Russia. Was that something that you wanted to be translated on the page? Was that something that obviously came naturally? Did you have to edit it in? I mean, because there are these little moments of brightness.
Oh, definitely. Well, you have to find brightness in the grayest part of your life. And growing up in the Soviet Union was pretty gray. We didn't, I was, as I said, I was growing up after Stalin's death, so we were not mortally afraid to be thrown into a gulag camp
Right.
for telling a joke, which was what happened to
Yeah.
my mother's uncle was arrested in 1937 for telling a joke, and it wasn't even a political joke, but
So
someone
that was
reported,
true.
yeah,
That
someone
line, oh my
reported
gosh.
mhm, him, and that was it. And he never returned. He was sent to Gulag. He never returned. Um, so it was called, someone called it carnivorous times. Those were carnivorous times when people were killed for jokes. Then when I was growing up, they were sort of more like vegetarian times. So you wouldn't be killed for telling a joke, but there were still dissidents, for example, were still persecuted and arrested and sent out of the country. And that's why, that was the time when great writers, poets, Joseph Brodsky, for example, artists, ballet dancer Mikhail Baryshnikov, who defected in the 70s, and a number of artists and other intelligentsia who were either persecuted at home, arrested for the fact that they, did not, that they wrote or said something against the government, or they were sent out of the Soviet Union. But people like us, I was just an average sort of, I was growing up in a middle class family
Mm,
in Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. We, we were not, we still split ourselves in half. It was this schizophrenic existence when you could only tell the truth and what you really thought to a very limited group of people, your family and friends, close friends. And anyone else, anyone at work or anyone you didn't know, you would never discuss and, reveal
right.
anything of what you really thought. So it's this two parallel realities, to sort of this split existence. But I was not, at least I was not fearing for my life.
Right.
While this, the time in the book,
You were
before
really
Stalin died,
different.
people were afraid. People were shaking in their boots. Anyone could be arrested in the middle of the night. For anyone could be denounced, and people were denouncing their neighbors and even their family sometimes for the pettiest reasons you can imagine. For, a neighbor would denounce a neighbor just to
Mhm.
get the neighbor's apartment after the neighbor is arrested. It was this
Yeah, you could
carnivorous
feel,
life. I
yeah.
don't know what else to call it.
One of the things that I really liked about, I mean, you talk about that parallel life and the schizophrenia of it. And felt like this was such a subtle, it was such a subtle part of the book. It was not, because I mean, it could have been hammered home over and over again. Is Sasha decides to wants to be an actress, and they take this like kind of family trip to Moscow, and
Mhm.
and she sees this larger world where everybody's kind of acting like it's like living in the society at that point in Moscow in particular, and everywhere, it was all kind of acting. So you have this woman deciding that she wants to, dedicate her life to this art, and meanwhile everyone around her, and be truthful and live 1,000 lives and all of these things, and meanwhile everybody's living, like you said, two lives, but not good ones, right? Like I found
Exactly.
that
So,
really fascinating.
yeah, this is what I wanted to show. I think this was the most important thing for me to say with this book. If you are saying anything with your books, but it's the conflict between the truth of art and the official curtain of lies.
Mhm.
So the everyday life was a big state-sponsored lie. And Sasha wants to be an actress precisely because art does not tolerate falsehoods.
Right.
Art is the truth.
And I
And
think
that's what she wanted.
her mother's rage and her the cruelty when she left, I thought was couched in fear. So much fear for her daughter to leave and go do this thing, and I mean that's what I sort of extrapolated as a mother. But let's talk about Sasha. We can for anybody watching, please comment. Please like. For every comment and like, I'm donating $1 to UNICEF Canada, to help with children in the Ukraine. So make me pay, guys. Uh, so Sasha, as a young girl, she's being punished, and she's forced to stand kind of in front of the radio and stand there for hours. But because she's never inside at this time of day, she hears a new program, and it's Chekhov's Three Sisters, and she is lit on fire by this. Was there an experience in your own childhood where you experienced art in such a way that you were like, well, this is what I'm going to do no matter what?
Well, actually, this episode is straight from my sister's life.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
yeah, Sasha, her character is based on my older sister. My older sister was a prominent actress in Russia. She was 13 years older than I was, and she worked in a repertory theater in Leningrad. And all theaters in the Soviet Union were repertory theaters, which means that they had a permanent group of actors working there. They were on salary, and they would produce plays that would then run in repertory. So she worked for one of the best theaters in Leningrad, and she also worked in film, and on the radio. She did television, all kinds of things that actors do and did back then. Um, but I was, when I was growing up, I was a teenager and she was already an adult, and
Mm.
of course I wanted to be an actress.
Oh, man. I can feel that.
Even then I knew I couldn't. But this particular scene that you're describing, that was a scene from what she told me. That was a scene from her childhood. She was punished, and the grandmother put her in the corner to stand in the corner, and there was this radio in the corner that, and she heard, for the first time, she heard this program, um, and she heard Three Sisters on the radio, and she knew, she was 7 years old, and that's what she told me. She knew that that was it. She, all the other, she wanted to be an ice cream seller, or she wanted to be a streetcar driver. all that was in the past. Now,
Right.
from that time on, she wanted to be an actress, and she actually she was as stubborn as Sasha, and she defied her family. She was born in a provincial town, just like in the book. The family, of course, was against her becoming an actress or even auditioning for that best drama school in Moscow. But she defied them. She went to Moscow. She auditioned. She was accepted, and she became an actress. So that scene was actually, what my
True.
sister told me. It was real. Yeah.
Was there something for you? Was there a book that you read in your childhood, or was it in school that you when did you decide that writing was a thing you wanted to do?
It was early. I think it was early, maybe second or third grade. We read a lot of classics, of course, Russian
Mm.
classics, and some of them were stories by Chekhov. Chekhov, by the way, wrote a lot of stories for children,
Oh,
and
I didn't
maybe,
know that.
in this country we don't know that, but he did, and so did Pushkin. And there were a lot of fairy tales, Russian fairy tales. So we read a lot of literature in elementary school. And of course, I was a young pioneer, with a red kerchief like everyone else. You had no choice, 9 years old, you put a kerchief on, and you are supposed to be proud of it. But what we read, I knew back then that what we read sort of gave me some kind of, I don't know, one made me want write stories.
Mhm.
And I think my first, I was writing a story when I was 9, probably, and it was about a pioneer camp, or young pioneers. And of course we all went to pioneer camps. That's what everyone
You
did
did.
back then. So around that time, and I think I blame Chekhov for that.
That's fair. That's fair. He started you on this path. We have a question here, and it feels like so much of the story is coming from events in your own life, but did you have to do any specific research to bring this book to life, and how did you approach that? And I would ask, particularly when it came to what Sergey, or not Sergey, I'm sorry, on am I saying
Andre.
it right? Andre?
Mhm.
Well,
Andre.
particularly what happened to him. Like, what was the research around learning how these men got kind of sucked into this life of um what is the can you pronounce the word for me?
Apparatchik.
Yeah.
He was an apparatchik, a government official. Um, well, see, the research I did the research was about the war and the
Mhm.
battles and the conditions, and when certain laws, certain orders were given by Stalin, that kind of thing, because, historically it had to be accurate. Um, and the places when the front, how the front moved. Um, so I did a lot of research, and Vasily Grossman was part of it, and then also Svetlana Alexievich, who won the Nobel Prize in 2016 for her books that are nonfiction, that had to do, several of them are based on the war, World War II, and how Russians perceived it, and how, those Russians who were at the front and those who were not at the front, how it was perceived by
Right.
them, and what their experiences were, the real experiences, not the experiences in the Pravda, for example. It's the same thing. In the book, that's why I wanted to include this war journal by the uncle, because he saw it as a real,
Right.
he told the truth, while all the newspapers, and radio programs did not tell the truth. They were
Pure
propaganda,
propaganda.
just like
Yeah.
they are now, just like in Putin's Russia. They were all propaganda. So I had to read the real stuff, not the Soviet novels, but eyewitness accounts of the war and what really happened. So that was research, and that was heavy reading. That was difficult reading because, well, for obvious reasons.
I mean, I know you did that research here in North America. Are
Yes.
those books available in Russia? Like, can
Good question. Good
I mean,
question.
can kids find the truth if they go looking for it?
Not about the special operation in Ukraine, no. There's nothing true about that
Yeah.
available right now. But about World War II, yes, you can find books that had been banned when I was living there, but that became available when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power with his policy of perestroika and openness, and that was in late 1980s. So a lot of books that had been previously banned in Russia became available in the late 1980s. And some of them, like Solzhenitsyn and the real description of the Gulag, and other writers who wrote about the Gulag on the basis of their own experiences because they were prisoners there. Those books became available, and they are available now. It's just it's just Russians do not want to connect the
To
dots,
that.
to
Yeah.
see how history repeats itself.
So
And
when it comes to Andre, was his slow, um, metamorphosis into what he became, is that something that people saw all the time? Like there wasn't much research that needed to happen because you were seeing it in your neighbors and friends. Oh my God.
yes, exactly, exactly. And I have to say that Andrei was probably the most difficult character for me to write because I personally was never close to anyone like that in Russia. I knew people, I worked with people like that. My boss was like that. I had several bosses, and they were all like that. They were all party members. They were all apparatchiks, government officials who sold their soul, basically.
Yeah.
Some of them believed in it, but some didn't. Um, so he was the most difficult one to write, and I had to make some sort of leaps. I don't know, some uh, guesses, I suppose. But because I had the background, I knew the milieu, I knew the that regime very well because I grew up in it. I guess I wrote him.
I will say as a reader, and you spent such a good amount of time, compelling and interesting and fascinating and important time in their childhoods. The scene where he gives the friend the bomb, gives the friend the found the found bomb, and then another scene where he kills the grasshopper, and then the scene with what happens with his family. Like those three scenes, I like you saw his anger, and you saw his rage, and you saw his bully, his like internal bully, but you gave it so much room for some compassion, right? And that Sasha, and she's young, and you did such a good job of like why she like, because he could carry the sugar bags and all the things that young women love about young men. And so your creation of this character made, to some extent, what happens inevitable. And it was a great choice, a really painful choice, but it's only having finished the book that I can look back and go, well, it was all right there. Like, it was all right there. So I thought he was great.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so happy to hear that because he was definitely the most difficult. Um, Sasha is based on my sister, and the family, a lot of it is based on my family. My mother was not as punishing, as severe as Sasha's mother, but she was an authoritarian. She was a survivor. She survived the war. She survived Stalin's terror. Um, she was a
You did it.
survivor. I can't blame her for that. I mean,
You did a great job of painting that generation of women who the men that came back from the war or from the gulags were no help. They were absolutely no help. They sat beside sheds and drank and smoked cigarettes, and these
yes,
women became doctors, and they ran the show, and they were terrified all the time, and I believed her too. Was the grandmother somebody from your life? Because she created this warmth. She
She did.
really.
Yeah, yeah. My grandmother was very warm, and my grandfather was not. He was the Bolshevik. He was the head of the house and ruled everything with an iron fist, just like Stalin. But my grandmother was she came. They got married before the revolution of 1917, so she came from uh, what Bolsheviks called the ruling class.
Yeah. She had
She
hats.
was, yeah, she was sort of from lower nobility, and she also wanted to be an opera singer.
Hmm.
She had a great mezzo soprano. She studied opera in Moscow, but of course, you know, it wasn't. She couldn't sing on stage because she was a woman. How can a
Hmm.
decent woman sing on stage? So she
Right.
became a housewife. But she was, I just remember her as very warm, as someone who really was like the glue of the household, and she held everyone together with her love and her blini.
Elena, what are you working on now? Now that you've got your first book, your first novel out of the way,
And hopefully learned a few things.
and hopefully, I mean, the hot spots, we can write some books about it using that.
Well, I started working on something else, on another novel, which is also set in Russia. I don't know if it's a mistake, but it's set at a little later time in the 1970s, the time when that I knew well personally. And it's just too early to talk about it, but
Mhm.
it has to do with banned books.
Oh, wow.
So I just wrote a little essay about the books that were banned in the Soviet Union, and then they were unbanned in the late 1980s during Gorbachev, as I said. Um, and that was just a fascinating topic for me because it was to get a book. There was a line to get a banned book, that was
Mhm.
smuggled into Russia, something like Dr. Zhivago, for example, that was completely banned until the late 1980s.
Wow.
I personally did not read Dr. Zhivago until I came to this country, and because you could not
Right.
get it.
So when you read it, were you like
Well,
baffled
I
as
knew what it was about by then. I mean, we all,
yeah, right.
yes, I
You'd seen
probably
the movie.
I probably saw the film before I read the book, right, with Omar Sharif and Julie Christie. But then I read it. I read it in Russian, and then I read it in English, and it's still on my shelves. I have several copies in both languages.
We
But banned books, that was fascinating.
we when the United I live in Canada, when the United States, when the stories were coming out about the school districts trying to ban books, and one of them was Mouse. um my husband is Jewish, and my son is very invested in graphic novels. So I went to our local independent bookstore and I was like, well, I'd like to get a copy of this. And they were like, yeah, it's completely sold out. And more than that, it hasn't gone into printing for like 20 years or something. Like it had not been printed again. And now they could not print enough copies because this book, some school district in Tennessee had banned it. Which is, I think, the way we should be responding to these stories we're hearing about banned books is just keep buying the books.
Right.
Just keep buying. Well, Elena, I have to thank you for not just coming on and chatting with me. This has been so enlightening. But for writing this really beautiful book, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it. I really encourage everybody out there to go out there and grab it because it's gorgeous.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you. I'm really so happy. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And
My
thank
pleasure.
you for donating to Ukraine.
Yes, I will keep commenting, keep watching. I will tally up the comments and the likes tomorrow and tell you how much we're giving. Everybody out there, please stay safe, have a drink, read a book. Thanks, guys.